Good, e- good evening, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Sports Exchange. My name is Scott Morgan, off the Motor City Madmouth, and I am pleased to be joined by Stuart Hack. Stuart, how have you been?
I've been good, Scott. Great to be back. Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. Phil Lewis, it's always a pleasure to have you back on. I want to give everybody an overview exactly about where you work and what you're doing.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. I teach at the University of Albany. I teach several courses, but the one that we'll be talking about tonight is the one that is the sociology of sports, and we cover quite a bit. And this is one of the topics that we cover, and I've been asked to talk about in a couple different places.
Well, we're looking forward to your insights tonight. And of course, my name is Scott Morgan, Motor City Madmouth, the owner and publisher of the South Florida Tribune, and the mastermind behind all these broadcasts that we have here on the network. And you can find us here on our YouTube channel, South Florida Tribune. Please subscribe to it if you haven't already. And you can also track us on Twitter at Tribune South. With that said, I have a couple of mentions here that I want to get to. And one of them is the attire that I'm wearing. And that's called the Mississippi State Bulldogs, my little hoodie with the Mississippi State Bulldogs. Why would I wear such a Mississippi State Bulldogs shirt, hoodie? Well, you know what? Congratulations to their baseball team. They won the College World Series, and that's the first national championship that they've won in any sport. So to all of our fans up in Mississippi, congratulations on a job well done, and we're glad that you're able to finally have a national championship for your trophy case out there for sure. A couple of other things I want to mention to our friends north of the border. Happy Canada Day to our friends north of the border. Being a Detroit guy, I used to take that trip over the Detroit River to go to Windsor. So, you know, whenever I wanted to go there, whatever I was going to do, hang out across the border, I do that. And a little funny story about my ties to Canada is, you know, when Pop Rocks were illegal in Detroit, I used to go across the border and get them. Of course, everybody knows that you can get prescription drugs or drugs over there, but I never went there for that reason, just mainly the Pop Rocks. And I never did a whole lot of gambling in the casinos. There are a lot of things to do in Windsor. So happy Canada to our friends north of the border. And since we have an accountant here on the broadcast, Mr. Hack, and a Mets guy, okay, we call it a multi-dimensional thing. Today, July 1st, is Bobby Bonilla Day. And for those individuals that wonder about Bobby Bonilla Day, the guy gets $1.19 million on July 1st. This will go through 2035 until the guy is 72. And if that isn't good enough, he's got a second deferred situation with the Mets and the Orioles, which began in 2004 for 25 years, and all he does is make $500,000. So Stuart, your man Bobby Bo, you know what? He's doing pretty good, isn't he?
You know, when he came to New York as a free agent in 1992, he said, "You're going to have to wipe the smile off my face." They haven't done it yet. He's going to be collecting until he's 72. It actually, at the time, wasn't a terrible deal from the Mets part. It allowed them to eventually get David Wright by him deferring some money back then, you know, just so. And this was in 2000. This was Bonilla's second stint with the Mets. They just wanted to get rid of him, and you know, they worked out this deal, and it's not that uncommon. There were other players. Brett Saberhagen had a similar deal. Even now, Mike Trout has a deal that goes. Max Scherzer for the Nationals has some deferred money that's going. So, you know, it's a big joke and everything, but you know, hey, Bobby's happy. Maybe he'll give some tours of the Bronx for people. If anyone remembers the reporter incident when he was with the Mets, where he told the guy in a threatening way, "I'll show you the Bronx." So now he could run tours, and you know, I wish him well. I wish him well. It's a nice.
The joke was bringing him back a second time.
I know. They never. Well, there are a lot of things you scratch your head about. Maybe they were hoping for lightning in a bottle, but you know, his first stint, and he was a free agent. They're really one of their first big free agent acquisitions, and he had some decent seasons for him. You know, maybe, you know, they didn't really win like they wanted to, but he wasn't horrible. And you know, eventually they traded him. They got him back. That didn't work well. Though Ricky Henderson had a card-playing partner in 2000 during the playoffs. But you know, it's fine. everyone can laugh about it now. The Mets are in first place, even though Jacob deGrom has given up 3 runs tonight, which I'm very upset about, which probably triples what he's given up all year.
Well, I do know that Bobby Bonilla last played with the Mets, I believe, 1999, and finished his career with the St. Louis Cardinals in 2001. Ever since then, he's been collecting that check or two from, like I said, 1.19 million, and that's good enough. $500,000 isn't so bad. So now that we took care of all that business and got that out of the way, we'll take care of the major reason that Mr. Lewis decided to come back on the show. Once again, Phil, we're glad to have you back on. And obviously, the hot topic of the day is a Supreme Court ruling on student athletes. And you said there was a 9-0 unanimous vote dealing with antitrust law. So Phil, take it away.
Yeah, that's actually not the most recent event in the NCAA. Actually, since then, the Division I Council has responded to to the Supreme Court decision. And as you probably heard, now image and likeness and name are waived. The restrictions on those are waived for NCAA players, and almost immediately, several have already gotten sponsorship. So you had the Supreme Court case the other day, the one in a series of cases that have been litigated about these type of issues. And really remarkably, the Supreme Court is rarely unanimous on anything. So having that response is quite telling. So the NCAA has long tried to protect the distinction between amateur and professionalism. This goes back really to the first case in the series, which was in 1955. Didn't go all the way to the Supreme Court, but it went to the Colorado Supreme Court. And when we get to school, right, Fort Worth Lewis, no relation, college was playing against Trinidad College, I believe it was, and a offensive lineman named Ray Dennison was kneed in the head and eventually died about 2 days later. And he was 26 and he had a family, and his wife petitioned for workman's compensation benefits and death benefits. And initially it was approved. And when the NCAA and became aware of it, the college became aware of it, they vigorously fought it, saying that he was a student athlete. And that was really the first time that term, that mythical term, student athlete was ever used, because obviously it's thrown around now as a badge of honor that student comes first and an athlete comes second, but that's not really how it was originated. It was a way of avoiding labeling a player as an employee of the school, even if they were receiving a scholarship, which, as Stu knows, is compensation. And taxable, by the way. I think I hear from a lot of the Division I athletes in my classes that they are very surprised. Their parents are very surprised when they get a tax bill for the full scholarship or even the partial scholarship. And this was, and he lost, and the widow lost, and that was the first distinction in the long line of court cases where the NCAA tried to protect this image and this concept of amateur versus professional. The other big one that most people have heard about was in 2016, the case that was brought to the Supreme Court, where EA Sports ran a series of video games. And a UCLA player who played briefly for the New Jersey Nets, named Ed O'Bannon, saw his likeness in the video game. He said, "That's a UCLA uniform, and that looks like me." And a lot of other players got into a class action suit, and they said, we're not players anymore. We shouldn't be under the auspices of this amateur status. And eventually the NCAA said, no, we own your likeness forever. We own it for the rest of your life. And it got to the Supreme Court, but they rejected it. It never got a decision there, and effectively just floated around the court. The lower court said, yeah, you're right. They should own your likeness forever, but nothing's really going to come of this case. And that's kind of been mediated a little bit since then, where the likeness is not used in video games as much, but nothing really came of that. Now, there's been some movement on name, image, and likeness. And of course, the Supreme Court said very, very clearly that the amount of compensation that a player can get should not be limited to the cost of attendance. That was always the line in the sand. So it was, the standard tuition, room and board, and meal plan. Basically, that was pretty much it. And they always said, well, we can't give you a computer, and we can't allow you to have a job over a certain amount of money, and you can't have a paid internship and all these other perks that largely any other student could get. And that was what the Supreme Court decision was about. But a lot of people see it as the tipping point for further litigation, and eventually what a lot of people think might be the path to players getting paid. But we can talk about what that actually means.
All right, so I guess my question to you as we go through the chronology here, Phil, is the Ed O'Bannon case was really what laid out the groundwork for a lot of the things that we're going to talk about during the course of the broadcast. Is that correct?
The most recent one, right? Because that was the one that got to, well, at least it was petitioned to the Supreme Court. And it was the one that, people resonated with people. If you had an accounting video game and you had a character, an avatar that looked like Stu would like some of that money, and this was just the application of that in college, where these players now got through their eligibility, and they said, okay, you're still selling the games. I'm not an amateur anymore. And that's where I think a lot of people it could relate with the fact that it was so visual and it made so much sense.
All right, now I'm going to go over a bunch of key points in this order, and Stuart, feel free to implement any time you want to. But you talked about comparing budgets with Texas against Albany. You want to talk about David and Goliath, or big versus little, or anything that you want to do. Well, what was your point when you were comparing Texas against Albany?
Yeah, I think a lot of people don't realize, if you're not a very avid fan of NCAA sports, if you're just someone who watches it casually, you might not understand this. The structure of the NCAA is pretty much stratified between the Power 5 conferences and everybody else. And of course, when I say everybody else, that means everyone else who's in Division 1. When you start getting down to Division 2 and Division 3, these issues are almost irrelevant, because if you don't have scholarships and you don't have these same kinds of financial incentives, it almost doesn't apply. But Division 1 is really the Power 5 conferences, the big ones that have the big TV contracts, and everybody else. So, for example, UAlbany, where I teach, is considered to be a mid-major. There, when Stu and I were students there, the budget was, I don't know, Stu, $1 million maybe. I mean,
they were Division 3 when we were there.
In Division, right? So I'm saying back then it might have been, I'm going to guess, about $1 million, maybe two tops. Now it's about $23-25 million, which is far in excess of what it used to be. But my point was that when you compare that to a Power 5 conference school like Texas, their athletic budget was, the last time I checked, about a year or two ago, about $225 million. So you could conceivably have UAlbany making it into the NCAA tournament in basketball and getting a seed against Texas, and now you have a team with a $25 million budget against a team with a $225 million budget. So it's just a real evidence that what we're really talking about here is two different worlds: the Power 5 student athletes and everybody else. So when you hear these kinds of things, that, oh, these two twin sisters just immediately got a T-Mobile sponsorship for their social media, well, they're in a big time school. I don't know that a lot of what we're hearing about is going to apply to probably 60% or 60-70% of NCAA student athletes. It's not going to be an issue, because these schools like UAlbany just don't have the money. If this were to play itself out to its logical conclusion, where you'd have student athletes being paid. And I also have used the example where a coach at UAlbany, head coach at UAlbany, explained to me that she sat down with a recruit in the living room of the family, and the parents said, well, this other SUNY school has offered us what was added in 2015 is called enhanced scholarships. That's been the one sort of accommodation that's been added on to the cost of attendance, which is really unlimited meals and unlimited snacks. I like to refer to it as limited snacks because it really is that just, trivial. So the schools can add on a few dollars for meals outside of traveling, because they get their meals covered when they travel for games. So the parents said, well, this other school offered us the enhanced scholarships. Can you? And she said, I don't know if Albany does it now, but at the time they didn't, because they couldn't, ostensibly, because they couldn't afford it. And it was, well, she lost the recruit, and it was going to be a nice addition to the team. So what are the dynamics going to be as these things continue to play out, if they go on to their logical conclusions? And who is it good for? Well, obviously, it's good for the small percentage of Power 5 Division I athletes. Absolutely. And no one's arguing that. But is it in the best interest of the sport? Is it in the best interest of fans? What's going to happen to the transfer portal and the rules about waiting periods and sitting out? Are you going to see players now jumping from school to school 4 times in 4 years or 4 times in 5 years because now they're getting a better deal, a nicer computer at this school, and then they have a good year and another school can give them a little bit more? What is this going to look like? What's going to be the continuity, and who's going to benefit? Again, if you want to look at rights of people and antitrust issues, and you can compare this in some ways to the Major League Baseball reserve clause being eliminated or partially eliminated in 1975 and opening up free agency. Absolutely, that was good for, it brought up salaries, it made things more fair. But is that the best interest of the fans? Do you want to see a player come to your team for 1 or 2 years and then he's gone? Do you want to see you want to go down and root for a team in Mississippi State, and then they're going to have 4 different teams every year? They're going to have a different team every year for 4 years. It's a larger societal issue. One's about doing the right thing legally, and the other one is, what are the implications on the sport? And to be, I guess, cynical in some ways, where is the focus now going to be for these student athletes? Is it going to be giving their best efforts to win and help their team win? Or is it going to be to get their brand and their image as elevated as possible? And now maybe some of their decisions are going to be detrimental to the team, or maybe not detrimental to the team, but maybe not in the best interests of the team. I'm not playing today because, I'm a little sore and I don't want to lose an endorsement deal with this company. So that's really where this may end up. And what does that mean for sports in general? I'm not sure it's going to be good for everyone. It's maybe the correct legal decision, but I'm not sure that as spectators and coaches of the teams might feel that this is the best thing for everybody.
All right, I'm going to talk a little bit of college basketball, but somehow, some way, Phil and Stuart, I'm going to incorporate a little bit of NCAA football here, and you'll know where I'm going in a moment, okay? You talk about the NCAA college basketball, $10.8 billion deal with CBS, and I think what we also like about that tournament is you have the big schools versus the small schools, majors versus majors. So when we tie these two concepts together, we all know that we love these upsets, and that's what makes the NCAA March Madness what it is. But tell me the impact of that $10.8 billion deal with CBS and where all that fits into the equation.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. And I've actually had a administrator from the NCAA come and explain this to my class. And it's fascinating. They claim, and she went into great detail about this, charts and graphs and everything, that the NCAA itself doesn't keep any of that money. They pay their salaries and they redistribute every dollar they claim. I mean, there's a small reserve fund, so maybe not 100%, but a high 90% of their total, that $10 billion, they claim they redistribute for expenses for the tournaments. When the Final Four or the Final 16 get in there, they pay for all the expenses of the teams that are remaining. They pay for championship games. They pay But the biggest expense is redistributing the money back to what they refer to as the member institutions. So, for example, just to use UAlbany as another example, in the history of UAlbany in Division One, the men's basketball team technically won one NCAA basketball game. It was a play-in game, but nonetheless, it counts. That generated a certain amount of money for the university. That was something the NCAA then redistributed back to the conference, and then the conference, in theory, gives it back to the university and the member institutions. So that $10.8 billion, the NCAA is going to tell you they're not keeping it. They're a bank. They're taking it in and then they're redistributing it. But who's winning? Who's winning these games to earn these big paydays? Well, UAlbany won one. They won I should be fair. They won one. The women's team won a game against Florida. So the university won 2 games. So they got some money for both of those. But the question is, where does the money go? They claim it gets redistributed for expenses and to the member institutions. So the more powerful you make the Power Five, the more the schools get, the more likely they are to win tournament games and then get more money. So it's a redistribution of wealth in a sense, but they're claiming that they're not keeping that money. They pay their salaries. They pay Mark Emmert, I'm sure, a nice salary, and the administrators, and then they claim at the end of the year they've got nothing except for this little reserve fund. So when you ask the question, why are the member institutions, some not being able to pay as much as others, that's because a lot of them don't win anything or have a big enough budget to position themselves to win enough to get some of that money back. So there's, I think, a lot of confusion. Now, if you take the NCAA at their word, they're giving that money back, and that doesn't create the kind of wealth that you would expect, but we don't always take them at their word.
Very
Now,
interesting.
now, do you think, Phil, the difference between NCAA football and NCAA basketball, is there a difference in how this ruling will affect each of those sports? Because football is a more profitable thing to many of the big schools, where basketball, they barely break even.
Most barely break even. Depends on the TV contract. No, it should have no impact. In fact, this leads us into a Title IX conversation. Most, in all fairness, with the exception of probably Connecticut and a few of the Final Four teams in women's basketball who are excellent, in their sport. Most women's teams don't make much money or any at all, but because of Title IX, the money has to be redistributed across the sport. So no, it wouldn't have any impact because of, first of all, women's teams would be eligible for these kind of sponsorship, even if their teams don't make any money. But no, this, as far as I know, wouldn't have any impact differently for anybody. But of course, the larger question is, obviously, if you're on North Carolina in football or basketball, but if you're in a high team that gets a lot of TV exposure, the likelihood of you getting a sponsorship deal is pretty high. If you're someone at a mid-major who's scoring 8 points a game, or a field goal kicker who's no one ever heard of, the chances of you getting a sponsorship deal are relatively small.
All right, well, when you look at the dynamic effects of college basketball per se, I think that's the one thing we love about the tournament. You have the mid-majors versus the majors, and these upsets are unbelievable. So it doesn't really matter. The playing field's a lot even when you consider that you may have one and dones. A lot of these other players of smaller schools are staying their duration. So I think that's what really makes the NCAA basketball tournament so interesting, is the mid-majors versus the majors, and the big schools versus small schools, where you had David and Goliath playing. I think that's why it's so popular, isn't it?
Yeah, I think the other thing, yes, I agree with you. But the thing that, the upsets are still relatively rare, but the possibilities are certainly there. And the fact that you could have a team that has a $225 million budget playing a team with a $25 million budget, the fact that could happen is interesting to people. And certainly when the games are close, at least for the first half, it becomes even more interesting. What a lot of people are unaware of, and interestingly, there's a parallel universe here. There's another governing body in college sports called the NAIA, and for most, by most accounts, they have much looser rules. So it's almost as if all these things that the NCAA is holding on to now, you can have as a student athlete in the NAIA, but it's, you know, they're not high profile schools. Scottie Pippen went to a NAIA school.
Lewis,
Gene Upshaw in football went to an NAIA school. What's that?
I believe that Scottie Pippen went to Central Arkansas.
At the time, it was an NAIA school.
Yeah,
I'm not sure if it is now
as well. I think it was Southeast Oklahoma, but yeah, one of those smaller schools.
Yeah, no, that's correct. And it's interesting that, you know, there is this other world that student athletes could play in and ostensibly get all the things that they're trying to get now. It just, there never was a big movement, you know, that for the big players to say, well, I don't like the fact that I can't be sponsored on my social media, post. I'll go to, you know, some other school. Just it hasn't happened. But there is another place that they can go. It never became bigger than what it is.
Yeah, we'll talk about those upsets being rare when your office pool gets destroyed in the first or second round, and all of a sudden 4-13 versus 5-12. Just kidding with you, by the way. So, but as we talk about football, you know, College of Charleston, you know, I know they're talking about the NCAA playoff now expanding from 4 to 12 teams, and now when they get something like this talking where they say there's smoke, there's fire, there is a lot of that because I get a lot of those updates. So how do you, you know, again, we talk about names, likeness, and images. This is yet another dynamic where you wonder how could the College of Charleston have done under a playoff system, and it's just a matter of a few. This is not a matter of if, but it's a matter of when before we see this dynamic play out between the Power 5 schools and the mid majors and the at-large teams. So, how do you think football fares into this whole process, knowing that you've done a really good job, Phil, outlining the basketball schools per se?
Yeah, I'm not sure I know the answer to how football is going to play out. I mean, there's obviously a lot more players involved, a lot more scholarships involved, a lot more, a much bigger budget involved. But as I mentioned before, maybe not here, but I mentioned before, I still think some of these things are going to take a long time to flesh themselves out. I don't think that you're going to see another case come before the Supreme Court in a short period of time. I don't think you're going to see players being paid formally anytime soon. And most of that is because you would have mid-majors and smaller schools crushed because the money has to come from somewhere. So if you had, you know, let's just use football, for example, if you had a quarterback at a mid-major school who had a good year, you know, Albany had an example. They had a freshman quarterback. He had a tremendous year, led him to the playoffs, and he was back the next season. You know, what would happen if now, you know, Syracuse, you know, just down the road, not down the road, but in the general area, said to him now, you know, hey, you know, we're going to pay you more. We'll give you something larger than what you're getting in the package of Albany. You know, that would just consistently seem to be the case, where it would almost be like free agency. And good for the quarterback, and good for the coach who's getting a better player, and good for the athletic director who's probably going to get a bigger bonus because, you know, the teams are winning more often. But how is that good for the fans? How is that good for the institution? How does that help student athletes graduate? You know, lost in all this is anything to discuss about graduation rates and how that might be affected. If someone's transferring around 4 or 5 times, are they ever going to graduate? And how is it going to add to the burden that they have and their responsibilities of being a student and an athlete and now a media presence, right? Now they have to divide their time 3 different ways instead of 2 different ways. And the larger possibility is that now they're going to be bringing in media experts or agents and say, well, no, he's not an agent. He or she's not an agent for my sports career. They're a career coach, even though they're an agent. So now some agent is going to just change their title from a sports agent to a career coach, and they're still doing the same thing. And effectively, you're just making all these players professionals. And then the question is, what are they doing at a university? Why even have them at a university? In Europe, I don't know if we've ever talked about this, Stu, and you and I, but in Europe, if you want to play sports at that age, you play for a club team in that town or in that area. The question is ultimately, what are these athletes going to have to do with the university? Are they going to be true students, or are they going to just be media presence, media personalities that are on your team? Where is this going to play itself out to? I mean, it's a reasonable question. I'm not sure that it's going to get completely out of control, but I'm sure at some schools it will get out of control.
I think when people look at college football too, though, and I talked to a few of my networking associates earlier in the week, is they didn't realize that a lot of these big guaranteed games, like for example, Florida Atlantic University schedules like 2 or 3, where they know they're going to lose by a large score, but yet they know they need that money to finance the athletic department. And again, you have Nonson Howard Schnellenberger built that program from the ground up. No one, I'll take it on the chin on the scoreboard, but look what I was able to do and build that culture. So when you talk about big time economics and athletic departments, I think that's part of the equation.
Yeah, and the other thing, and I'm not sure this is what we were planning to talk about, but I think it certainly applies, is that, let me ask the two of you if you know the answer to this question.
Okay.
During the student athlete's first 24 credits as a student, what is the minimum NCAA GPA that they have to maintain to maintain their eligibility?
I'll take it. Go ahead, Stu.
Go ahead.
I would think, but I have a feeling it's going to be lower. I would think 2.0.
I would think
Okay,
2.8.
2.8?
Yeah.
There wouldn't be that many teams holding full squads then. Stu, the answer used to be 2.0, and then there was the feeling that it was too restrictive. So the answer is 1.8. So now you have this combination of remarkably low standards to maintain eligibility. You have another lane of traffic for distraction. And you're mixing money, with a situation where the focus is supposed to be education. Now I know that people are going to say, well, any other student on campus can get any kind of job they want. They can get a paid internship and all these kinds of things, but they don't have the distractions of getting up at 6 a.m. to lift with the football team. I mean, I've had plenty of football players in my class who show up, looking very haggard for a morning class, and I'll say, what's going on? They say, well, I was in the gym lifting at 6 a.m. and then we have, a 4 p.m. lift. So they have these responsibilities to train. They have these responsibilities to play. They have responsibilities to travel and go to meetings and all these other kinds of things that the average student doesn't have to take on. So they have more bandwidth to get a paid internship or other kinds of things. Now, again, from a legal point of view, I think it's probably great it's probably the best thing that could happen to make the playing field, no pun intended, a level for everybody. Not disputing that. I'm looking ahead to what the impact is going to be on a program, to a fan base, and to the sport itself.
Well, then I'll take my 2.8 number and translate it into the University of Notre Dame over in South Bend, Indiana, or the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, because apparently, judging by your numbers, nobody's getting into those universities with a 1.8. And, you talk about academic excellence. The one thing I've really enjoyed learning from you on this is that enhanced scholarships. I didn't know much about that. I hope a lot of people, why don't you redefine, Phil, what that enhanced scholarship is? I think that's really neat, because then you're able to tie that into the fact that the small schools are losing top recruits to the big schools that are on tight budgets. I know you were able to tie those two concepts together. So why don't you reinforce that, please, Phil?
Yeah, I mean, that was really a response to the fact that there was a lot of criticism from the NCAA saying, these are kids who are lifting in the morning, who are training all day, and they can't get any meal money. They can't, they're starving. I mean, I literally, this is an absolutely true story. One of the first guest speakers I had in my class was the athletic director at the university, and came in, gave his time, was very well prepared, was very nice to, come in at 4:15 in the afternoon and speak to the class. And I literally had a student in the back of the class who screamed at him when it was questions and answers, you're starving these kids, these poor student athletes. You can't, they can't get any money when they're not on the road. So the NCAA, actually was the Division I Committee on Standards, approved enhanced scholarships, which literally just means on top of the cost of attendance, they can get unlimited meals and unlimited snacks. Well, most kids are on a meal plan anyway, so largely what it means is unlimited snacks. They can get some pizza money. And I don't think anybody would argue with that at all. But if school A can give it and school B can't, they run the risk of losing, the student, the top recruits who have some options. If you're, the 10th player on the team, or in football, you're the second string tight end, you're going to take probably the best deal. You're going to take whatever deal you can get, but there are going to be, your first or second recruits who are going to say, I'm good. I know I'm good. My parents know I'm good. And I want my piece of money, if, or whatever else I can get. Now it may be a little different, but that's largely what was added in 2015. But, the definition of rich, of Scott, right? The definition of rich is, for a lot of people, if someone has one more dollar than they have. And
Right.
This is really one of those situations. It almost creates a situation where someone is getting just a little bit better deal than you, and I want that deal too. So that's what that was about.
Do you see how this could affect, like, how the NBA, for college basketball, a lot of the better players coming out of high school do the one and done college-wise. They play 1 year college ball and then they go straight to the pros.
Yeah.
Do you think it affects the mindset if they come in now, they're going to get compensated for going to college, and maybe the colleges make some sort of deal that you stay 2, 3, even 4 years, but they'll be compensated for it? Or do you think it doesn't have any effect on them? And if they want to go to the pros, that's the ultimate goal for some of these young athletes, that's what they're going to do?
Well, I actually see it going the other way. As you certainly know, there was no requirement during, Moses Malone and days and LeBron James days, up until, I guess, really fairly recently, LeBron James, when players could come directly out of high school. And then they've kind of short-circuited that. There was a committee on academic standards led by Condoleezza Rice a couple of years ago, maybe 2 years ago. And one of the recommendations is this one and done stuff is not working. It was well-intentioned to try to keep kids, in going in the direction of college, at least make them think about it for a year. But it's really not worked out the way that it was intended. So if anything, I see somebody going to the Supreme Court and petitioning for the right to go directly from high school to college. And I think, the precedent's been there. And I think if anything, you're going to see one and done going away, and more of these really good players going directly, or at least trying to go directly from high school into the pros. I don't see the likelihood of tying a student athlete to 2 or 3 years as being something that anybody could really argue was reasonable.
Well, let me add to that point, Stuart. You bring up a really, really good point. The G League has an enhanced G League, so now they're starting to pay guys a little bit more for the one team with a lot of the top prospects. And a lot of these young guys that can't go to the NBA right now are playing overseas, so they're going to get paid one way or the other, whether it's overseas or in the enhanced G League, and they'll ultimately make their way to the NBA as well. But that's an excellent point, Stuart. So, the one thing that I thought about doing this broadcast today that kept entering my mind a lot was Reggie Bush, who says he wants his Heisman trophy back, as well as his records reinstated. The Heisman Trophy is refusing to do it, and the NCAA not giving isn't being cooperative either. And, you know, not that I value the Heisman Trophy a lot anyways, because just because you win the Heisman Trophy doesn't mean you're going to be the best pro. But Reggie Bush is a name that's being talked a lot about, knowing full well that he's controversial, had a really good career over at USC and a pretty good one in the NFL. But what's your take on that Reggie Bush situation, Phil?
Well, Reggie Bush is not the most controversial of former Heisman Trophy winner. Yet the ones who have been more controversial have got to keep them. So, I mean, if you want to make that argument, it's kind of hard to argue that he's the worst offender in the history of the Heisman Trophy. I think it would be much more consistent, take it away from everyone who's done anything, you know, but of course, others have not technically violated the NCAA rules. They've just done other heinous things. What is my take on it? He violated the rules. His family received $300,000 in, you know, benefits. It wasn't close. It wasn't pizza money. It wasn't, you know, he was, you know, probably the highest, you know, the most attractive recruit out of high school in his year. He manipulated the system. He went to the highest bidder. You know, he didn't restrict his ability to make a living. I don't have a problem with the NCAA holding, you know, onto that rule. But they could probably take it away from one or two other people.
That's fair. Okay, now we know you like to talk about sports video industry, EA Sports. So now is your opportunity to tie this one to this whole concept.
Well, I mean, it's just another example of where name, likeness, and image have been used. And the magnitude of video games is obviously much larger than it was before. I think just to not to change the subject, but you know, you raise the issue of where else this could be important. You know, we're witnessing right now a very interesting turning point in sports, college and in pros, in terms of the embracing of gambling. And now again, you have a situation where you're mixing money and results of games and making players more high profile. And I think you know that there needs to be another reexamination of how far, you know, sports want to let gambling into their arenas. No, again, no pun intended. I mean, I've now the last few nights, you know, you guys watch the Mets. You know, I've learned more about Allen Iverson's gambling habits the last few nights. I mean, he's on every 5 minutes on a gambling commercial, and you know, good for him. You know, he's got a sponsor, and then good for him. But the question is, where does gambling play into this? Where does winning and losing play into the contracts that these student athletes are going to get from sponsors? And I don't know the answer, but it's another dimension in this whole discussion. Where is allowing discussions? And I mean, there's discussions now that not only is sports gambling going to be legalized in more states, but they're talking about having sports books in the stadiums, in the arenas. So they want to cut off some of the action that's going to the local casinos or the online apps and everything. And they're talking about, for example, you want to bet on the Met game, instead of, you know, getting on your app, just walking down by the Shake Shack and, you know, placing a bet in the next booth, you know. And where does that become an issue? Do you do that at a NCAA, you know, a tournament? Do you do that at a Division I game? And where does that factor into the calculations of the young people that are now going to be involved? Does that make them, you know, want to be more high profile? Does it make them want to be less high profile? Where can they do sponsorship for gambling? I mean, it just raises a lot of issues.
Well, so then when you put in perspective about sports video industry, you're tying it more or less, Phil, to gambling. Is that as well as the name, images, and likeness, if I'm hearing you correctly?
Well, yeah. I mean, the opportunities now extend far beyond just, you know, the local car dealer. You know, sort of the joke was that if they, made this available, some mid-majors, player around here would go down to the local, do a TV commercial for the local car dealership. That would be kind of the extent of it. But now there are opportunities on social media. And what would it mean to the integrity of the sport if you had, I don't want to use anybody's name, but the Heisman Trophy winner or the person who was leading the balloting that season, the Heisman Trophy, now doing a commercial for a casino or for an online gambling, organization. And, what kind of questions would that raise about the integrity of the game? Because once you raise questions about the integrity of the actual outcomes of games, all this comes sort of crashing down. And I think there's some risk there.
I don't know if you would necessarily see that for players that are still active. A lot of these gambling commercials are people like Allen Iverson who aren't in the game anymore.
Now, right now, that's correct. But the question is, when this fully develops, could you see the week before the national championship game in NCAA football, Division I football, commercials where it's not Allen Iverson. Now it's whoever's leading the balloting for the Heisman Trophy, or who's ever the Dick Butkus Award winner.
But my point is, if you look at the people that are playing professionally now and are getting paid for it, they are not, the commercials they're doing are not gambling commercials per se. In the pros, people who are doing the gambling commercials are no longer playing. They're no longer active.
Right, but where is the line going to be drawn? When they say now that they can use their name, image, and likeness, it doesn't say anything about where and when, or for what organizations. I'm saying, who's to say that it won't extend to something like that? And is that also going to be a problem for the sport?
I think there's a fine line to all of this. And if you look at the initial Supreme Court ruling, which didn't really take image and liking, and it was just basically new ways, as long as it's related to education, which I think is a broad thing. Yeah, they can get a computer, but a computer that's issued by the University of Texas might be a different kind of computer than what Albany would issue somebody. I think it's become very subjective as to what they can do, and you kind of start bending the rules. And unless they have something in place very stringent, and I don't know if that's even possible to do that where it's fair for the majority, it will be interesting to see how this works. And the other question that I wonder, we talked earlier in the show about the casual fan. So say 5 years from now, if a casual fan just turns on an NCAA football game, are they going to notice any differences while they're watching that broadcast of the game than maybe they would if they were watching 5 years earlier?
Well, I think the one thing that you can be sure about is there going to be more transfers. I mean, the transfer rules are tied to this, or at least running in a parallel fashion. And I think 5 years from now, you're going to see far fewer 4-year players, far fewer players who are going to stay at one school for however long they're going to be there. And the question is, are they going to, start taking themselves out of games because now their brand could be impacted as opposed to what's going to help the team win as much. So, I could see something where the player just signals to the coach, I'm going to stop playing now because my foot is sore, as opposed to having the trainer make that decision or have the team doctor make that decision. It's very similar to the Zion Williamson situation where he put his foot through the sneaker, and then I think he shut himself down for the rest of the season. And no one could blame the guy for doing it. It's, you're entitled to be healthy and prepared for professional sports. I just think you're going to see a lot more of that if now there's more invested in every single, well-known player.
Well, take that to another level then. Now you have a lot of football players not playing in bowl games because they're preparing for their NFL careers too. How many times have you seen, when they're ready to turn pro, these guys don't play in these bowl games where they used to in fear of an injury. We can do another show of how many key players got hurt during a bowl game and watch their professional value diminish quite a bit. I have a couple of other points I want to get to while we're at it. You talk about superstars speaking up and athletes being employees. Why don't you go ahead and elaborate on that? Because it sounds like with this being such a high profile, hot topic, with superstars speaking up and athletes being literal employees. Now, I know that Northwestern for a period of time tried to get their players paid, and I want to get to these other states that we're going to talk about, but we'll start here and then we'll branch off into the other thing, if I may. Once again, I repeat, superstars speaking up, athletes as employees, and then you can tie Northwestern into that.
Well, Northwestern situation was very interesting. They unionized. They attempted to unionize, and that's another dimension I think is potentially down the road. But my point is, what perspective are you taking? Are you taking it from the perspective of the spectator, who, in theory, is paying the bills by watching the content and is being the target of advertising, so the rates go up and everybody makes some money? Are you taking the perspective of the university's graduation rates, or are you taking the perspective that it's a big pot of money and everybody should be entitled to it equally, or at least no one should be less entitled to it than others? But as I said, I think this was a olive branch by the NCAA, the name, image, and likeness suspension. It's a waiver, by the way. It's not a complete change in the rules. It's a temporary waiver until Congress can come up with legislation. So it's a temporary situation. In theory, it could be reinstated. It's unlikely that it'll be reinstated. And now the ball's, again, not to use another sports term, in the court of Congress to come up with something permanent. But I think over time everything is going to be explored. I just don't think it's going to happen overnight. But I am concerned about the outliers. I am concerned about a big time quarterback taking himself out of a bowl game because he's worried about his brand. I'm worried about, maybe not in a bowl game, but maybe a couple games before that. I'm concerned about where this could go in certain situations. And I am also concerned about the gambling aspects of this. I'm worried about there being, the potential for some, point shavings or games being thrown, because now there's more money involved, there's more profiles involved, I just think that when you solve one problem, often other problems arise.
So with that said, we talk about what we've talked about tonight. Where does the word boosters fit into this whole thing? Because now you may be opening up another can of worms. They're the ones that were financing these guys, and everybody was getting caught with their hand in the cookie jar, probation's right, left, and all of a sudden the NCAA willed their power with the boosters, and now where do they fit into the grand scheme of things, if they do at all?
I don't know, but it's a great question. It's interesting. I heard Bobby Knight the other day criticizing John Wooden, and you almost never hear anybody criticize John Wooden. But I didn't know that much about it, but apparently the great UCLA teams had, one or several really influential boosters that were helping out with recruiting during those great years. So boosters are very significant, and I think a lot of this is going to be unknown, the Wild West. I think you're going to see a lot of rulings by the NCAA over the next couple of years on these unusual cases that are going to crop up because of this. But boosters are always an issue, and unfortunately, if you look very closely at the NCAA bylaws, a lot of times boosters can accidentally get into trouble by just doing the most innocent things. The famous bagel. You guys know the NCAA had a rule where you could give someone a bagel, a student athlete a bagel, but you couldn't give them the bagel with cream cheese.
I heard that.
Did you know about that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, those kinds of things can happen. I don't know, but I mean, all these things are in play now in a bigger way, and the impacts are good. I'm just concerned that just to summarize everything, I'm really just concerned as a fan that for some players, their brand is going to become more important than winning and losing.
Are there any previous court challenges that stand out in your mind? I know, of course, what you mentioned Ray Dennison at the top of the show, but let's just talk about previous court challenges that stand out in your mind, Phil.
Well, the biggest one in sort of a general way is the reserve clause in baseball. Players were bound to the team that drafted them, and unless they were released or traded, they were bound to that team for life. And it's not exactly the same thing, but these cases are starting to go in the same direction, in the sense that the control is being loosened up. So I would say the reserve clause goes, back to the 19th century, and these NCAA decisions go back, not quite that far, but a long way as well.
Stuart, I know you and I talked earlier today about the 6 states. You want to go into more detail about that, please?
Well,
The names and the likenesses and so forth. Go ahead, Stuart. You brought it to my attention. It was a very interesting point.
I mean, these are states that have big collegiate programs. They're Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Mississippi, New Mexico, and Texas. And this was after the initial and Supreme Court ruling, which really was just expenses or compensation related to education expenses. These 6 states were talking more of likeness, things like jerseys, things that would have the athlete's name on them, where they would get compensated or they'd get a piece of the pie.
Yeah, what's amazing is when you look at that list, Phil, Florida, Texas, Mississippi, Georgia, New Mexico, and Alabama, and you look at the size of a few of these states like Mississippi, New Mexico, and Alabama, I would think that those would be the 3 states in my mind that wouldn't be on a list, considering they're a lot smaller. But yet, when you look at the type of programs that you have, especially Alabama, that's a pretty interesting list in its own right, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, and that's actually an interesting point. That it doesn't have to be just New York and California and Florida that have the biggest programs. In fact, New York really doesn't have, aside from Buffalo, a big college football program, and even that's kind of small in the grand scheme of things. No, you raise a good point, but it's the Power 5 versus everybody else. That's what it really comes down to.
Yeah, a few other little minor points I want to bring out. We talk about gambling being prevalent all over the country, but Stuart, can you believe this? A long time ago, that Willie Mays and what was it, Mickey Mantle were actually barred from baseball because they were greeters. I mean, that to me is so far-fetched. And then when you think about Las Vegas getting 2 teams, and they very well could end up being 3rd, and there's gambling everywhere. Even in my hometown of Detroit, you got 3 major casinos in the area. They got casinos everywhere now. So what are you going to do? Go ahead and gambling is just something we all have to live with, regardless of where you're at. And I think that when we put this entire broadcast into perspective, Phil, you've been able to bring out so many interesting points about these names, likeness, and images. And I love the way all 3 of us attempted to try to make some sense out of the thing. So when you put it in a nutshell, is there any way to make any sense out of any of this?
I think this is the early stages of new direction in college sports. I think that there's been a lot of pressure on the NCAA. They've done as much as they could do to hold off the criticism. And I think that this decision about name, image, and likeness was sort of an attempt to relieve some of the pressure. It's going to be very interesting to see what the next step is going to be, whether it's going to be another Supreme Court case, or it's going to be one set of students at a university like Northwestern taking it upon themselves. Will this be enough for certain players, and will this be just for a few players? The question is going to be how many student athletes are going to be able to take advantage of these opportunities. Is it going to be just a handful and not really benefit a lot of people, or is it you're going to see it trickle down to a mid-major where on every team they've got to deal with the local supermarket or the local car dealership or the local Walmart or whatever it is. I don't think so, but then again, it's too early to tell. I think for sure you're going to see a next step. I just don't think it's going to be addressed indefinitely. I think this is going to be a very evolutionary kind of changes.
Yeah, I often wonder what California is going to do, because everybody always wonders what California is going to do. I'm wondering if Jerry Tarkanian, the late Jerry Tarkanian, would be eating a green towel instead of a white towel, and then you wonder whether or not sometimes certain schools from other states would play other ones, because you feel these athletes are getting paid more money, whether you have a level playing field as well, based on what the rules, because from what I was able to read up on this earlier, that until Congress and there's anything like that universal law that kind of keeps it cradled in, there's so many different things that we could talk about on 9 million shows that we're trying to wrap it up and try to keep things in its perspective, Phil.
Yeah. You got to remember that sports have long since received antitrust exemptions. That really what the reserve clause was. So it's not terribly surprising when you hear that sports has received these things. I was a little surprised, and I won't mention which justice it was, when one of the justices said, if this was any other business in the United States, it would be blindly illegal, patently illegal, which he's right. But the point is, sports has always received special treatment. And it shouldn't be surprising that there has been a history of it. If you want to say it's time to stop it, that's a different conversation. But to say this is different than any other kind of business, everybody who has anything to do with sports kind of knows that.
All right, Stuart, anything else you want to add?
No, I think we've covered a lot.
Yeah, I think we did. And I hope that a lot of the folks that are watching this broadcast, they have a pen and paper. And if you're interested in what we have to talk about, there's a lot to take notes on, because this is something you're going to hear a lot more about as this whole situation unfolds. And we're happy that we're doing it on July 1st, the first day a lot of this is all started to take place. So let me tell you, I can only imagine what the developments are going to be going forward. But meanwhile, Stuart, why don't you once again let everybody know how they get a hold of you? Phil, let you do the same thing, and then we'll wrap up the broadcast as well. Go ahead, Stuart, you lead it off.
So I'm Stuart Hack. I'm the owner of Hack Tax and Accounting Services. I was named the best accountant in Palm Beach County for 2021. So thank you for all those who stuffed the ballot box for me. I could be reached. I'm in Wellington, Florida. Stuart at hacktaxandaccounting.com. My number is 561-214-6171.
And don't forget to let your fans know that you open up a third office as well, because you certainly are proud to mention it on social media. But since I did it for you, okay, no problem. Okay, Phil, go ahead, take it away.
Yeah, I'm not gonna give any information other than the fact if anybody wants to sponsor me now that that's available. I'm not in eligibility. I'll be more than during class. I'll be more than happy to wear a logo over here for the right price. So if any of the big corporations are listening to this, contact Stu and he'll get in touch with me. He'll be my representative on this.
I'm wearing face masks that the clients give to me with their companies on it, and I wear them into meetings. I don't know if I get a cut or anything, but I don't know.
Well, I'm wearing a hat, and this is my company, the South Florida Tribune. And if you want to I am the CEO, the publisher of the South Florida Tribune. You can reach us at www.southfloridatribune.com. But you can also email me at southfloridatribune@gmail.com and follow me on Twitter at Tribune South. So, for any of you folks that want to go ahead and check us out, please subscribe to the South Florida Tribune YouTube channel. You'll have a lot of shows like this on there. We try to keep it very real. And we hit everything that there is out there, sports and non-related sports issues. So on behalf of Phil Lewis and Stuart Hack, my name is Scott Morganroth, the Motor City Mad Mouth. Thank you for joining us on this edition of the Sports Exchange. And we hope that everybody has a safe 4th of July weekend, and please be safe. Of all holidays out there to get hurt, this is one that we can do it. I know we provided you with a lot of fireworks worth of information about this subject, but stay away from the ones that can hurt you. And if you don't believe me, ask John Pierre Paul. Once upon a time, he got hurt badly, and I had to mention it because the University of South Florida Bulls graduate. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining us on this edition of the Sports Exchange. Good night, everybody.
Right.
Right.